It was not supposed to be a controversial issue, but the United States objected to a UN resolution on sexual violence in conflicts, and the text was amended. So, has the US failed rape victims in wars, and how much politics is at play here? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The international community agrees that rape must stop being used as a weapon of war. The United Nations passed a resolution to combat sexual violence in conflict zones, but after it was watered down. The US opposed the use of the words sexual and reproductive health, which its delegation feared implied it supported abortion. 13 countries eventually voted for an amended text without the controversial phrase. The final version also removed a reference to a UN monitoring body that would report acts of sexual violence. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, has more from the United Nations in New York.
The German foreign minister presided over this meeting about one of the gravest issues possible.
Women and peace and security, sexual violence in conflict.
You'd think there'd be unity and joint resolve, but as ambassadors arrived here for the meeting, it was clear there was deep division.
There is a dark cloud on the Security Council on an issue that we're supposed to be closing ranks and agreeing on. Unfortunately, it's the politics of this.
If we believe in the values of the UN, if we believe in the values of women's rights, this is a real fight. And there are attitudes that we just don't understand.
As the Council heard from the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and Nobel laureates Nadia Murad and Dr. Denis Mukwege, tense negotiations continued about a draft resolution written by Germany. The US had already fought to get references to the International Criminal Court removed, but backed by China and Russia, it also wanted changes to the words sexual reproductive rights, because it argues that phrase implies support for abortion. The campaigner and lawyer Amal Clooney made it clear the council would be judged by its actions.
This is your Nuremberg moment. Your chance to stand on the right side of history. You owe it to Nadia and to the thousands of women and girls who must watch ISIS members shave off their beards and go back to their normal lives while they, the victims, never can.
In the end, the German delegation rewrote their resolution. It passed with US support, but with abstentions from Russia and China after the controversial wording was removed, the Council effectively caving in to US pressure.
Thank you very much. That was hard work.
European nations say they are dismayed by the US position and believe this battle is not over yet. They detect the hand of the US Vice President Mike Pence in trying to roll back the internationally agreed position on women's rights for the last quarter of a century. One diplomat described the alliance between the US, China and Russia and others outside the Security Council, including Saudi Arabia and the Vatican, as the axis of the medieval. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Let's have a look at some of the sexual violence cases in different war and conflict zones. It's estimated that more than 20,000 Muslim women and girls were raped during the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995. The UN says more than 6,000 Iraqi Yazidi women were kidnapped and sold as slaves by ISIL fighters in 2014. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a report found that there were average 48 rapes every hour. And Myanmar troops were accused of systematically raping Rohingya women in Rakhine State. Let's bring in our panel. Joining me on Skype from Washington, D.C., Rina Shah, Republican strategist and consultant. From New York, Antonia Mulvey, Executive Director of Legal Action Worldwide. And also on Skype from Uppsala in Sweden, Angela Muvumbu Sellström, University of Uppsala's Department of Peace and Conflict Research. Welcome to the programme. Let me begin with you, Rina Shah, in D.C. first. What should have been an easy resolution to pass was made more difficult because the US had a problem with just a few words: sexual and reproductive health. Can you just explain to us why this administration has such a problem with something so simple?
Well, I think we have to look at the source here. And the driver on this issue is Vice President Mike Pence. If you look at his record back in the Indiana State House and frankly, all the way to the U.S. Congress, I was on Capitol Hill as an aide at the time he was a congressman. He has been fervently pro-life. And he's had a problem with the lexicon around pro-choice language for a very long time. So to think that this could be coming from Secretary Pompeo or anybody else within the administration would be misguided. This is entirely coming from Vice President Pence, and it's coming now because it's seen as a political chip. This is a win for the evangelical base of the Republican Party that brought Donald Trump to power in 2016. So I don't even think President Trump has anything to do with this. I think this is purely a political move, and it's ideological entirely for Vice President Pence. So those of us who've been pro-choice in the party for a very long time, there is no changing the minds of those who are driving this. And it's simple. It's something that they're doing because Donald Trump is going to be back on the ballot, and they want evangelicals to feel certain that this administration supports life.
So this is about domestic politics, not about international politics, not about foreign policy.
Correct. And they're not thinking about the foreign policy implications. They're not looking at the record of President George W. Bush, who made exemptions when we looked at non-governmental foreign organizations that were doing so much good in places like Africa to help rid us of these awful things. HIV, let's talk about what's happening to young girls. Again, rape being used as a weapon of war. I just want to add really quickly a little bit of color. In 2008, I was a Capitol Hill staffer. And at that time, I happened to work for the only member of Congress who still was against abortion in the case of incest and rape. So the Republican Party was not always this way. It was shocking when I found out the member that I worked for did that. But it also told me that the party was still very understanding of this issue and willing to flex. It's gone a complete different direction now.
Angela, Rina, just very quickly, are you still a Republican after this decision?
I am. I've made my career in the party, and though I have not been very supportive of this administration, I am willing to look at the good they do. This is not an area where I think they're doing anything right. They're not listening to advisors. They're not understanding the implications, the bad implications that this could have on U.S. foreign policy moving forward, even after President Trump is out of office. They're just being very boxed in, and this is about domestic policy, as you put it. So it's hard for me to support the party, but I also believe that I'm part of this next wave of agents of change that will be here to hopefully get back to the core principles of the party after the Trump administration is long gone.
Angela in Sweden, let me bring you in here. You've heard our Republican strategist there say that she's actually disappointed in this decision. What did this decision mean for you?
Well, I'm not an expert on domestic foreign policy or on the Republican Party's internal dynamics and Vice President Pence's views. But I mean, everything that has just been said points to the fact that this decision and the sort of obstruction of language around sexual and reproductive health or around mechanisms of accountability in this Security Council resolution, that all of these machinations are really against evidence. They're not based on the evidence of what sexual violence and armed conflict is, or on the kinds of initiatives that are necessary for helping survivors of sexual violence rebuild their lives, heal physically, integrate better into society after war, or just in general for us to have a greater sense of accountability for perpetrators of these acts. So what I really feel is that the obstruction of that kind of language is just a way of it's a political act, and it's it's going in the face of a lot of evidence of how this violence occurs in war, how it's used as part of war, and it's going against the distinguishing between whether or not such violence requires particular measures to help people who are completely innocent and have really been victimized by these horrors. And I really wish that there would be more effort to educate evangelicals, to educate domestic constituencies, to educate the public, and to really raise awareness about what it is, what sexual violence and armed conflict really truly is.
Antonia in New York, you've heard our guest in Sweden there say that this is seemingly a political thing, legally speaking. Is there any recourse the Security Council has? Can it come back and toughen this legislation up, or is the legislation, in your opinion, now weakened because of the change by the US?
Well, we have to look at the facts on the ground, and as a former UN investigator for sexual violence, I interviewed hundreds of Rohingya women who've been subjected to brutal gang rape. And when they crossed the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh, there was a lack of access to reproductive and health sexual services. And it resulted not only in some of the women and girls dying, but them having children born of rape. So we have to look at two parts of it. One is the Security Council resolution itself and the absence of these services, but what has been the impact on the ground? And how are we going to improve our services to women and girls? We're representing women and girls in South Sudan who were brutally gang raped and subjected to sexual slavery. When they crossed the border from South Sudan into Uganda, there was also not the availability of these services. So the US, this is a culmination of its policy of not to support organizations to assist women who have been survivors of brutal sexual violence. And I think we have to look at it in the bigger picture and what is happening. I also want to add that if we look at that resolution, it was not only the absence of reproductive sexual services, but it did not mention LGBT rights and also women rights defenders. And so the US also did nothing to address that matter, and that's also extremely concerning.
Do you think now, though, Antonia, that this resolution is a non-starter, or do you think, yes, it has been weakened down, but we can still use it as a framework to move forward?
You know, I think overall it is actually going in the right direction. So we have 3 losses that I just mentioned, but I would say there are 5 wins in this resolution. Firstly, it focuses on a victim-centered approach, and we saw Nadia Murad at the Security Council speaking. Secondly, it emphasizes the role of civil society, organizations like mine, Legal Action Worldwide, that represent victims in their quest for justice. Thirdly, for the first time, it mentions about sexual violence against men and boys. Fourthly, it talks about children born of rape. And fifthly, about the role of the recognition of UN investigations and fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry. And that's really important. So I think we are moving in the right direction, and we should look at those wins as well.
Angela, in Sweden, what do you think? Do you think that you are moving in the right direction with this, or are you a little bit more pessimistic?
I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic. I think that I agree that there are really important steps within this resolution, and even in the process of negotiating the resolution I mean, you can see from the text and the coverage of the debate that civil society has been really active and recognized and contributed to finding solutions and to developing different tactical measures around a whole range of things. And I think that's really important. But I'm a little bit alarmed that we seem to be moving backwards. Most of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions since 2000, and now we are in almost 20 years since the first resolution on women, peace and security was passed in the UN Security Council. Most of these have received, increasingly a universal approval and acceptance. And so now we find a situation where China and Russia have abstained from a resolution on sexual violence. And we find that the language has been watered down, and that the country that has been pushing the resolution had to make important compromises. It's not a deal breaker. I think that it's better. We live in a better world today because of this resolution than without it. But I do think that there are some real cause for alarm that now that this has become much more politicized than it has been in the past. And so that would be my concern.
Rina, in DC, the Americans this administration seems to be taking a go-it-alone approach. It's not listening to its allies, certainly not as much as previous Republican administrations or even Democrats for that matter. It went against the Germans and the Italians and the British in this particular decision. You're going against your allies now. I mean, how alarming is that for you?
Well, it's less alarming than it was 2.5 years ago, because it's been 2.5 years of watching this administration forget who its allies are and forget about what America's real role in the world is. And I think overwhelmingly, the American electorate still is very philanthropic. We are the #1 most philanthropic population in the world. We believe in doing good across the world, spreading that good in ways in which this resolution could do. However, I think when we get to the root of why this administration views this action in this way, it's because of the thought of our role with the UN. What does the UN mean to us? What do we mean to the UN? There's almost no regard for it. And then, frankly, the go it alone, the isolationist approach, this is just the trademark of this administration. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, has come to disrupt. And so if he isn't turning things on his head, in his mind and in the minds of those around him, he's not really doing his job. So essentially, I think what this really is, and this is really sad, is that there's a sense that Americans, the administration thinks that Americans don't want their taxpayer dollars to go towards funding abortion. And I think, again, if you look at how the partisan breakdown is on this issue, obviously we know that more Republicans care about that. But at the end of the day, I just don't see any movement forward. And that's what also troubles me, is I think we're going backward on women's issues, and we're not doing what we should be doing as good stewards of issues, women's issues. We've been leading the way for years. Where does this put us now? And if our seemingly the allies follow, that really means bad things down the road for women's reproductive rights and sexual health. So I'm really concerned. I am.
Rina, there are a number of countries in the world, there are a number of people in the world that will be watching this and wondering why abortion, the woman's right to choose, is such a hot button issue in the US. I wonder if you could just very quickly explain to our viewers why this is so controversial. In every other country, it's just normal.
Yeah. Well, we have separation of church and state here, but if you look at this issue, you wouldn't think that's the case, because, again, there are so many lawmakers throughout the United States and state houses across the country that seem to legislate with their holy books. And so, there is a sense that people do come to public service with their views intact, and a lot of those views are guided by religion. However, I think if we had more servant leaders, people would be willing to accept other ideas and opposition to their views. But we're just in this moment of hyperpartisanship where this hot button issue that it's been for years is even more hotly contested now, and Republicans are unwilling to bend because it all comes down to my taxpayer dollar. We pay high taxes, and there's a sense of, what does that go to? Is it going to nation building outside of our borders, or are we going to start building within? And that's what this administration is trying to guide the narrative down that road.
Antonia, in New York, clearly the US is a very big player when it comes to the Security Council. Its opinions count, and it can do things like change language in United Nations resolutions. But I have to ask the question, how do you fight what Rina has described as being a hard right religious wing of the US? How do you get what you want, what you see as being right, into the language, into the United Nations?
I think it's quite shocking what the US's stance and what we saw during the Security Council resolution debate the 4 weeks prior to it and during the discussion. And I think we can't distance ourselves from the administration's decision and say that Trump did not support this, because he could have stepped in. And if we look at the US, increasingly it's isolating itself, as you mentioned, with the European states. I hope that they will come together and band together to stand up against the US, and maybe this will be a uniting moment. I mean, if we look at international justice and the US, it is very dismal dismaying. We saw recently, for the first time, the US has taken away, as we understand it, the ICC prosecutors' visa to enter into the US and threatened ICC judges. I mean, what does this say for the US, and why is there not more outcry about it? So I think that I would like to see European states, certainly civil society organizations like mine, will be lobbying them. And how can we reach out to other civil society within the US to stand up against this administration? Because it's going to affect, let's be honest, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of women and girls, also men and boys, who have been subjected to brutal sexual violence. Let us not forget that in Syria right now, there are LGBT persons have been raped and they have very little recourse to access to justice. And the US is not supporting passing to the ICC for many of these situations, or the ability to even take cases within the US. So I think it is a very concerning moment.
Angela, in Sweden, it's a very concerning moment. Also, what Antonia said was that this was a moment that needed more outcry. We haven't seen that kind of outcry from individual nations, particularly the European nations. Why do you think that is? And what tougher stance can the EU take against the United States?
Well, I think that depends. I mean, I think that on sexual violence and on the women, peace and security agenda, I do think that many of the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council have a really strong role to play. Sweden, where I sit now, has been instrumental, for example, in establishing really planting its flag down and around a lot of these issues, and making big commitments to multilateralism, to accountability and rule of law in the international system, to strengthening the UN. And it has a feminist foreign policy, the first feminist foreign policy in the world. So I do think that many other countries will step up, and they have stepped up in the past. And in a way, they are the ones who have really pushed this agenda forward. Because, I mean, let's be honest, I think that what's happened now is extreme, with this resolution, and what this particular administration, the Trump administration, has done is very extreme. But I do think that there is a dominant sort of tendency within the greater American public sphere to really distrust the international system and multilateral organizations, and to really and to distrust the UN, and to pursue a kind of special road and a very individualistic, exceptionalist position.
Angela, sorry, we are running out of time, and I do want to bring in Rina from DC here. From our other guests, you have heard, let's say, cautious optimism. This is a good resolution. However, we're very disappointed in the US's language, and we hope the US language changes. I just want to ask you very quickly, do you think this administration is capable of wheeling this back and it will change its mind, or do you think this is set in stone?
I think as of right now, because of the way the political winds are shifting in this moment, there's no changing. There's no going back. They need this win. Donald Trump is on the ballot in 2020. This is a political chip that they will say, we got you something. The evangelicals are not happy, despite getting 2 justices on the Supreme Court. They want to know that this president really means business when it comes to the issue of life. And so this is their best way of showing that. And this is about ensuring re-election. So there's no going back. I think this is set in stone, which is very sad, because I do think Ivanka Trump, the daughter of the president, may have quietly lobbied about this, but was unsuccessful.
Thank you very much to all our guests, Rina, Shah, Antonia, Mulvey and Angela Mavumbu-Sellstrom. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.